Hello, welcome to the Eugenics podcast. I'm Patrick Merricks.
I'm Marius Turda.
Good morning, Marius. How are you doing?
Good morning, Patrick. I'm very well. Yourself?
Wonderful, thank you. Today we've got a slightly different episode. We're talking about the use of eugenic themes in the movies. So let's begin with a more recent example. So what's Idiocracy?
It's one of the funniest movies ever made, I suppose. But of course, the attempt is to deal with a very important issue, which is what could happen if a eugenic program goes horribly wrong. So we have a comedic take on eugenics and portrayed under the guise of film. So that suggests how much eugenics still remains embedded in our popular culture, and how films are the best way to deal with some very sensitive issues, to raise awareness about eugenics.
So as soon as cinema was sort of available as a medium, those eugenic ideas were featured. So what's the Black Stork?
From the beginning of the 20th century, eugenics permeated popular culture, as we've seen last time when we talked about photography. But with the development of cinema and with the development of motion pictures, eugenics gets a new lease on life, as it were, because it becomes very clearly soon, it becomes very possible for film producers and organizations to distribute eugenic ideas and popularize eugenics through the medium of films. So you have some enthusiasts, such as the one portrayed here in The Black Stork, that argues for the elimination of defectives and embraces heredity full-heartedly, and argues for termination of those who are defective. So that is, of course, happens at the same time with people who criticized and ridiculed eugenic aims and eugenic potentials of certain people.
So there were many critics, even in the interwar years. So two examples are in film, with Tomorrow's Children and College Holiday. So what were these about?
Hollywood embraced the possibility of discussing certain eugenic themes early on in the 20s and 30s, but of course it wasn't always easy because of the topics, and some of the films were banned or censored, so they couldn't be released. So when some films got released, such as Tomorrow's Children or College Holiday, they tried in a way to engage and discuss serious eugenic issues, such as in Tomorrow's Children, about sterilization and about how problematic the entire program of eugenic engineering is, or through the medium of comedy to ridicule and undermine eugenic claims to build a superior race, as it is done in College Holiday, which is a musical and aims to really depict the ideas of eugenics in a farcical way. So both of them are meant to be for entertaining and entertainment, but ultimately they do push forward the eugenic agenda. They do take eugenics seriously, as if it is a science of human betterment that actually has credibility.
But despite the critics, eugenicists themselves were aiming for scientific sort of credibility and respectability. And here's an example from the British Eugenics Society in Julian Huxley.
Yes, it is important to remember that eugenic societies themselves commission films and their own propaganda campaigns to educate people on various eugenic issues, from contraception to birth control, and more or less issues of heredity broadly defined. And so you have a very good example here, the film from 1937 that features biologist Julian Huxley, entitled Heredity in Man, commissioned by the Eugenics Society in Britain. And Huxley is doing a very good job at teaching and educating the public in issues of heredity, but ultimately still working within the same narrative about some people are worthy, some people are not, some people represent bad heredity, others represent good heredity. So even in this particular case, which is in a way the epitome of respectability and objectivity, an attempt to make eugenics look scientific, you still have the same the same parameters that work with separating people, creating hierarchical systems, and ultimately using heredity as a means to control certain people who are desired and control other people's reproduction who are undesired.
So as well as entertainment and science, we also had politics as an influence on these films. So what would you like to say about Salamander?
Yes, whilst a film like the one we just discussed, featuring Julian Huxley, purported not to have any ideological underpinnings, it was done simply in the name of science and for education purposes. In other contexts, we see films propagating and distributing eugenic messages across ideological lines. So one of them is produced in 1928 in the Soviet Union, and it builds on the real case of the Austrian biologist Paul Kammerer's. But then it takes that example and builds an ideological conflict between the new realities being built under socialism in the Soviet Union and the new scientific worldview based on Lamarckism and the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And opposed to that is, of course, the oppressive, the fascist, the Western capitalist genetics represented by the Western world. So immediately becomes a very powerful way to instrumentalize political and ideological conflicts and to pass on ideological messages. So the Soviets and the Soviet regime was very good at doing that. And this is one example from 1928.
And now with the Nazi racial hygiene, we see politics influencing eugenics, but in a different way.
Yes, it wasn't only the Soviets who understood early on the power of cinema and the need to use films to push forward their vision of a new society, of a new man and a new woman. The Nazis too understood clearly, and the importance of propaganda in the Nazi regime is well documented. Within that, of course, you have a number of films produced to convince the general public of the importance of Nazi racial hygiene program. On the one hand, you have a big discussion about sterilization of mentally defectives and the legitimacy of the sterilization law introduced in 1933, and this is discussed in the movie produced in 1936. On the other hand, of course, you have a even more sinister take on eugenic themes, which happened with euthanasia and the T4 program. And this is a movie from 1941 that actually argues for the morality of the termination of life. So they were done with the purpose of educating the general public, but at the same time, but allowing the public to make up their own mind. So they were very subtly done in terms of how can we pass on the message at the same time underpinning the ideological arguments of the regimes towards a new racial future, a new racial utopia, a new society based on eugenic principles.
It's really this this legacy, the Nazi legacy of eugenics, which we see in more modern examples of eugenics in sort of film and TV, often with this dystopian sort of future portrayed?
Yes, it's that possibility that with the help of science, eugenics will return, and if it does return, will lead to totalitarian regimes, and it will lead to dysfunctional societies. So whether we're talking about genetic engineering or we're talking about cloning, or we're talking about regimes in the future that use women for reproductive purposes in a way that explains and is based on eugenic principles. It is ultimately that fear that science may, and eugenics through science may actually return, and if it does return, what options do we have? And how can we fight that? So it is interesting to see across a number of films produced today that all of these themes that appear from the beginning of the 20th century, the fear of genetically engineered society, the fear of building a superior race, the fear of the multitude of people who are not very intelligent or educated, all of these themes that you could see developing across ultimately converge into what would happen if a regime is able to implement that and then carry out a program that, as it happened in the past, could have absolutely devastating consequences to human liberties and to individual rights. So we're still seeing that developing, and I think it's extremely important to look at films to understand how eugenics survives in the popular culture and how much eugenic ideas are being discussed and transmitted and then assimilated by the general public in this way.
Well, thanks, Marius, for another very engaging discussion, a really fun one today as well, looking at cinema. So thanks for everyone for viewing. And once again, thank you, Marius, and see you next time.
Thank you, Patrick. Till next time.